The Cold War was one of the most significant periods of the 20th century. Although there were no battles between the major superpowers involved, the political policies that grew out of contrasting ideologies and mutual suspicion shaped the futures of the nations involved. During the Second World War, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union formed an alliance against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. This partnership was nicknamed the Grand Alliance by Britain's Conservative Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. However, as Hitler's defeat became inevitable towards the end of the war, tensions and rivalries among the Allies began to surface, which eventually escalated into the Cold War. The nations of the Grand Alliance were governed by fundamentally different ideologies. Britain and the United States followed a capitalist system of government and society, while the Soviet Union adhered to communism. In 1941, national leaders Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin were referred to as the Big Three. It was their policies and personal ambitions that would dominate international politics for the duration of the war until Roosevelt's death in April 1945. Churchill and Roosevelt were suspicious of Stalin, and in turn, he mistrusted their intentions. This heavily influenced their relationships from 1941 onward, and the stark differences in their political ideologies also played a key role in the deterioration of relations. During the 1930s, the United States and Britain criticized the devastating human cost of Stalin's methods to industrialize the Soviet Union. It is unknown how many Soviet civilians died because of the famines caused by his collective farming programs. However, Stalin's opposition to German fascism made him a valuable ally against Hitler, leading the United States and Britain to collaborate with the Soviet Union. Once the war ended, it became evident that relations between the three nations would likely become strained. While their ideological differences made it near impossible to reach a consensus on how post-war Europe should be governed, it was nonetheless important for the future development of the continent that attempts were made. The Second World War caused a huge shift in global politics. Traditional powers such as Britain and France, who had been major players in international affairs for many years, became less influential, while two new superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, emerged. It was the military and economic strength of both these nations that played a key role in defeating Hitler's Third Reich, but also laid the foundation for international tensions that would complicate future relations. The Grand Alliance was formed to coordinate the defeat of Germany and the Empire of Japan, known jointly as the Axis powers. Despite their alliance against Nazi Germany, distrust between the three Allied nations remained unchanged. The United States and Britain continued to be wary of communism, and Stalin knew they would not support actions that would strengthen the Soviet Union. The leaders of the Grand Alliance met 3 times during the Second World War to coordinate their military strategies and plan for the post-war world. These meetings took place at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, important strategic agreements were made that would affect the outcome of the war. Firstly, a second front in Western Europe was to be opened by the United States and Britain to reduce the pressure on the Soviet Union, who suffered terrible losses. This meant that the German army would become divided and would need to defend itself on 2 fronts. Secondly, Joseph Stalin agreed to declare war on Japan once the war in Europe had ended and would provide soldiers and armour in support of the United States in the Pacific theatre of war. The post-war futures of Germany and Eastern Europe were also discussed by the Big Three. Although there were no concrete decisions at this stage, it was agreed in principle, however, that the Allies' ultimate goal was Germany's unconditional surrender. Furthermore, the Allied nations wanted Germany to remain weak after the war in order to prevent any future conflict. As the Big Three had lived through the First World War and its impact on Europe, they were keen to avoid sowing the seeds for a third. When new international borders were discussed, it was agreed that the Soviet Union would keep the lands it seized from Poland in 1939. This was key for Stalin, as he looked to protect the Soviet Union from future wars by creating a European buffer zone. Additionally, the leaders agreed to establish an international body to resolve disputes through dialogue and negotiation rather than war, which laid the groundwork for the formation of the United Nations. The Tehran Conference helped to shape Allied relations. Stalin feared that delays in opening a second front were intentional, but was reassured that plans for an offensive in Western Europe were underway. Churchill favoured a Balkan front, while Roosevelt's support for Stalin's plan strained Anglo-American relations. Roosevelt believed that British colonialism was a bigger threat to peace than the Soviet Union, which deepened tensions between them. His growing bond with Stalin hinted that the Big Three could become the Big Two, with the United States and the Soviet Union dominating as global superpowers after 1945. Two years later, the Big Three reconvened in Ukraine at Yalta in February 1945 to plan the war's end and post-war Europe. By then, the invasion of France, known as Operation Overlord, had succeeded, with British and American forces advancing from the west. Simultaneously, the Red Army had driven the Germans back from the Soviet Union and now dominated much of Central and Eastern Europe and were welcomed as liberators from the persecution and barbarism of Nazi Germany. Stalin saw this newly acquired territory as a vital buffer zone against future German invasions and was determined to keep it. This stance underscored the Soviet Union's rising dominance in Eastern Europe and influenced discussions in Yalta, laying foundations for post-war tensions. At the Yalta Conference, the Allied leaders reached several pivotal decisions regarding post-war order. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, managed by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany was also forced to pay $20 billion in reparations, half of which was allocated to the Soviet Union. The Nazi Party was to be banned, and Nazi war criminals were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials, which saw the legal introduction of crimes against humanity. Plans for the establishment of the United Nations were finalized at Yalta, with its first meeting in San Francisco scheduled for April 25, 1945. Although Stalin sought individual UN membership for all 16 Soviet republics, only Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were admitted. Stalin also agreed to join the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat, which allowed the Red Army time to reinforce and reorganize its military. Additionally, it was decided that free elections would determine the future governments of Eastern European nations. The issue of Poland sparked significant disagreement. The Allies agreed to restore Poland's borders to their 1921 position, which granted the Soviet Union substantial territorial gains. Although free elections were promised, Stalin anticipated a pro-communist outcome, whereas Britain supported the non-communist London Poles. While Roosevelt and Stalin were satisfied with the agreements on free elections and the United Nations, Poland's future would remain a contentious issue, fueling tensions in later negotiations. Between July and August of 1945, the Potsdam Conference convened near Berlin and was influenced by major developments in the intervening period. In April of 1945, Roosevelt's death saw Harry Truman become US President. Similarly, the British general election saw Winston Churchill and the Conservatives lose power, with Clement Attlee becoming the Labour Prime Minister. Germany's surrender in May 1945 was followed by the first successful testing of an atomic bomb on July 16th, which coincided with the start of the Potsdam Conference. In June 1945, the Treaty of San Francisco created the United Nations, which was signed by 51 countries. The United States, Soviet Union, France, Britain and China were designated permanent members of the UN Security Council, and each were granted the power to veto resolutions. The new leaders at the Potsdam Conference shifted the tone of the discussions. Unlike Roosevelt and Churchill, Truman and Attlee were less experienced in diplomacy, which made negotiating with Stalin more difficult. Truman took a hardline approach, purposely delaying the conference until the atomic bomb was ready, believing it would give him an advantage, while Attlee, newly elected as Prime Minister, was eager to return to Britain and preferred to avoid lengthy talks. Despite tensions over the atomic bomb and the absence of a shared goal following Germany's defeat, the Allies were still able to reach some agreements. Germany was divided into 4 zones, each controlled by the Soviet Union, the USA, Britain and France, with its economy managed as a single entity. Berlin, although located within Soviet-controlled Germany, was also split into 4 zones, each assigned to one of the 4 powers. The Soviet Union insisted on significant reparations from Germany, but Truman was concerned that this would slow Germany's economic recovery. A compromise was reached, with each occupying power taking reparations from its own zone. However, as the Soviet-controlled zone was the poorest, they were permitted to seize a quarter of the industrial equipment from the other zones to make up for the financial shortfall. Agreement could not be reached on the governance of Eastern Europe. President Truman opposed the Soviet Union's dominance over the countries it had freed from Nazi control, seeing the Red Army as an occupying force. However, Truman's options for opposing Stalin were limited, as challenging the Soviets directly would risk sparking another war. Truman also disagreed with Poland's arrangements, especially its borders and the heavy communist influence in the government, and advocated for the establishment of a new government with less communist control. Although the Grand Alliance made several agreements during the Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, by the end of Potsdam, major divisions had emerged. Stalin sought control over Eastern Europe, believing it was crucial for the Soviet Union's security, while Truman saw Stalin's actions as an attempt to spread communism and viewed them as acts of aggression. Between 1945 and 1946, this core disagreement and rising mistrust turned the wartime alliance into a peacetime rivalry.